Now it's actually your turn to tinker or to engage in some interaction with Ken and Anne. Our goal really to start with is to, if you were not provoked, the idea is to provoke further conversation and dialogue and invite Ken and Anne to actually sort of hang out at the front for a little bit to kind of mix it up and to get the juices flowing and make the boundaries blurring even more blurred if it's appropriate along the way, with the goal at some point as the back and forth goes to begin a bit of an inventory of some of these challenges, which, Anne, thanks so much for starting us with this whole question of having to confront not only physical space, but the whole question about how to rethink interdisciplinarity and really blurring those lines between simple divisions of labor and really creating a kind of cacophony that has to happen to learn new languages and the like. So I think that's one big piece of, well, one big piece. It's a piece to the overall conversation. But let's ask for reactions to the morning's conversations, and please, I'm sorry. Right, and if you want to help us, Megan, that would be wonderful to sort of jot insights. I'm just gonna, this is not live for projection here. This is live for the camera. For those of you who came a little bit late, we are gathering the whole day so it can be edited, mixed, and remixed as people see fit for this dialogue here and for your own use. Sarah, why don't you start?
Yeah, it's oh, so this. Okay, now I understand. Okay, so project in the normal sort of shouting way.
Sarah wasn't here at the beginning. Why don't you take 30 seconds to introduce yourself?
Okay, I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Very nice to see a number of colleagues again. I'm Sarah Diamond. I'm the president of the Ontario College of Art and Design. It's a university in Toronto. It's actually a university that grants a whole set of different sorts of degrees. And we're in this process of very radical transformation to really take fairly traditional, siloed ways of learning and making and build a very strongly interdisciplinary graduate and undergraduate environment, including PhD programs. So that will be, I think, an interesting thread through this conversation, which is what is the nature of practice-based research? How does it fit within the kinds of disciplines or transdisciplines that many of us are engaged with? And I also was at the Banff Center for many years, where really many people probably know me more from that space. And I initiated something called the Banff New Media Institute that brought together scholars from across many disciplines, as well as businesses and artists. So very happy to be here. And also at some point, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives in the Canadian context that may have some good linkages here. I just was very struck within the conversation about the ways that humanities methodologies lead in a kind of interdisciplinary remaking of methodology that is not only the arts and the humanities. And I think we have to frame the question somehow where and there's fundamental humanities knowledge, for example, historiography, which I thought was fabulous. Your conversation around that. Design methods, however, if you look at design is so heavily hybridized and continuing to hybridize. If we look at the discourses around philosophy right now, I mean, a lot of the conversations around science and technology studies, which really are in a way in a humanities space, are defined by Latour's work as a sociologist and then the kind of philosophical currents we've spoken about. So I think one of the exercises is how to lead with what has been traditionally humanities methodologies into an extremely transdisciplinary space and make sure that the sciences are transformed in this. And at some point I'd like to talk at another intervention about the dialogues around data, or data, however you say it in the US, and the ways that that particular conversation right now, I think, is a lightning bolt of great relevance to the museum and the art gallery, because we have to kind of bring it back here, for the ways some of the questions of philosophy circulate that then have material impacts in all kinds of ways that aren't just within high culture.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sarah. Let me just invite some early reactions to to the question of translation and language.
Well, and let me just, in the book I elaborate this methodology called hermeneutic reverse engineering, which is exactly to meld the kind of philosophy of hermeneutics and the process of meaning elucidation, which is a method of interpretation that kind of underlies the humanities, with the practices of reverse engineering, which is a kind of set of kind of tried and true practices in across fields of engineering, precisely to inspire my engineering colleagues to not be as intimidated perhaps about the kind of interpretive process. So it's a kind of trying to open it up and saying that there's actually, you could consider the kind of investigation of meaning using these kind of methods as one step of your process of reverse engineering. You're just starting maybe a little bit earlier than just looking at the object to look at the kind of broader cultural context that the object is embedded in that might then yield some insights.
Ken, do you want to also offer a little?
Well, I like
from obviously being
I love that that juxtaposition there, because as an engineer, I think of reverse engineering as you have to open something up, you have to kind of you have to look at it and try and diagnose what its intentions were, et cetera. So it has a lot of commonality with hermeneutics.
It is. It is, right?
Well, I think those kind of metaphors are very powerful if you can speak across the divide. The two cultures, I think you're right. It's not. I think that engineers, unfortunately, they're not intimidated by the humanities. They're extremely arrogant, and they have some idea that that's all a fluff, and and I'm always trying to argue that it takes just as much rigor, just as many years of brutally difficult suffering to become a really solid humanist as it does to become an engineer.
Great. Just project that.
Yeah. I also have a question regarding larger cultural context, not a direct question to the presenters, but I'm sure they have a lot to say about it. Our main question, number one, I think almost ignores one huge gap, which is the question of commitment in contemporary art to what we're talking about here, to new media, digital art, new technologies. I think MOCA Cleveland, and I want to give them a lot of credit, is a big exception here in putting on an exhibition like that. If any one of us wanted to compile a list of all arts institutions and contemporary art exhibitions in the US, impossible task. Do it for new media art and digital art, and you can start with software in the 70s. Pretty short list, manageable task to do. So before even asking about bridging these gaps, where is the art form we are talking about within the museum context? There is not even a gap to bridge sometimes because there's no there at this point. So a fundamental question to me seems to be, how do we even create that commitment? What Anne has been talking about to some extent was also very much related to museum infrastructure and new technologies in that context. And I think every museum is interested in that and feels a need to proceed in that context. When it comes to the aesthetics of it, the social impact of it, a lot of it is being ignored. So one gap to fill, I think, is even...
You've provoked several people who want to just jump in, and it's all right, let's let them just jump in a couple of minutes. So I want to give Jill the privilege, but then go to Paula, and then come up here quickly. Just reactions to this piece. And then we'll come back to your intervention.
Well, thank you, Christian, for the acknowledgement. That's very nice to hear. I think a fundamental issue for museums is examining museum culture, not only the internal workings of how museums, but what visitor expectations are. And one of the challenges with new media work is the time element and the factor that most visitors are accustomed to very short encounters with art. And how do we think about the museum environment as a way that promotes, supports the interaction with more time-based work that might change and shape how you behave in a museum setting.
including perhaps even generative experiences, that not only being receiving the experience, but also participating in a remix of your own experience. And when we've certainly talked about that on your board, thinking about making the visitor experience something that's very proactive and very generative as well.
And how to escape, and I forget who back here said, the sort of gimmickiness, that you don't want art to have to just become new media art to be gimmicky in order to attract the visitors. So part of it is the responsibility of the museum, part of it is reshaping expectations and educating the visitor on how to experience art.
But also, I mean, you have to educate your board of trustees.
Speak up.
It starts there, really, because it is, yes, where you show these kind of art, where you show this kind of art in the museum. Of course, our museum never even thought about it. So it's here I come, and where is the video room, and there isn't. So how do you put it there? And that is really a very working against the grain. But then it's how do you talk to your funders and to your supporters about this, and how do you convince them that this is where the future is? And it's a huge work for general museums. I'm now talking to my colleagues, and I realize we're all in this situation. General museums have a huge work ahead to do, and it's just the beginning. Imagine that.
Good. Other quick interventions on this sort of conversation before we go to Howard and had some other insights. Jared, you wanted in, and I know Bruce, and so we're going to go Bruce. Sorry, Jared, Bruce, and then Len, and then to the back. I think Paul. Or sorry, I'll go back as well. Okay, please, quick, just
the thing that I think about when you walk through the digital exhibitions and you hear people saying worse than walking into an art museum where you hear somebody go, I could do that. You're hearing people say that the horrific, I'm doing that. And then you're like, but you're not doing that, because they don't see the fundamental understanding of what some of these things are. So the idea of, not even just from a production perspective, just from an aesthetic perspective and a critical perspective, being able to separate themselves from what they're looking at versus what they're doing, versus walking into a bookstore and saying, well, I write, that's writing, same thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to actually reflect a little bit on Christian's point, the changing nature of the art experience, that it's being pulled out of the museums. Net art certainly has always had problems in a museum context. Also, with Ann's point about the mixed facilities, I think is something to explore. The younger generation in particular, you know, the museum, school, after school, texting, mobile computing, those areas, and also just to make a quick note at the end, multiculturalism. That, you know, this is not just, you know, United States, we're looking at, you know, all the way around the world.
Right. Len, quickly, and I also wanted to privilege Saul earlier on here, so I'm actually going to get back there as well. Len?
I just wanted to mention that, and in your presentation, you use a phrase that I think is maybe key here, which was a reference to interlocutor among disciplines. And in fact, I think that's a lot of what we're trying to discern here. And the other side of that, if you bridge that, is a current siloism that exists among institutions and digital humanities centers, and which almost seems to be contradictory in terms to have the notion of a digital humanities center, which is in fact in a silo.
Yes.
And museums are in silos also, in contemporary art museums in addressing this issue are in silos. So perhaps you need interlocution among contemporary art museums to do this also. So I just want to raise those two frameworks.
Okay, so we're back to kind of a general kind of interaction with our folks here. Let's give the floor then to Howard, and then we'll come back to Saul.
I think we're on the right track as far as institutions go, and as Len just said, changing the silo attitude on the institutions. But I'm afraid we're not, as far as particularly younger individuals, that in fact they're way ahead of us, that the idea of interdisciplinarity is they're born with. And you know, maybe they'll unlearn it in school, but they probably won't. The idea of art production. This is a do-it-yourself generation that maybe started out passively looking at and listening to things, but now actively makes their own and actually does artwork. So the idea of really having to rethink how we educate them is I think off the table. It's not educating them in terms of making. It's educating them in terms of analyzing or understanding implications or making further connections. But it's our own actual institutions and the institutional structures, as well as maybe an older populace that has to be changed.
Thanks, Howard. And some of that may be the guerrilla activities sometimes required in order to begin to shift institutions. Saul, and then I'm going to jump up to the top and then come
A slight shift, and I want to take it back to Anne and Ken. One of the things I'm finding here already this early is the sloppiness of language. Interdisciplinary gets thrown around as if we all know what we're talking about, and as if we all have the same definition of it. And I would like to take it back to both of your references to Heidegger, because seemingly both of you are advocating that we reframe our understanding of the term technology. Could you speak on that?
I'm going to let you react to Saul or anything else that you've heard, these kind of little interventions, as we sort of just, as I walk back up top there, and give you a chance to perhaps offer us a bit of synthesis or translation services, to use Anne's term.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, language is a very, in a way, it fails us to be able to address some of these questions. I think you're right that I don't like the word interdisciplinary either. I think that that tends to emphasize the spaces between, and I also don't believe in the idea of abolishing disciplines. That we need those silos, if you will. That they're actually very powerful. So that I think it's strong that I believe that students should have a discipline and a deep rooting in one of them. I like the term paradisciplinary because it kind of conveys this, umbrella-like activity that can bring them together under some finds commonalities between them. Now, the Heidegger aspect, I don't want to derail. I don't want to get off too far down on that side, but it was interesting. We both are thinking about a more fundamental understanding of technology. I think that it's certainly, the digital it's not just the digital. That I feel very, very strongly that we're very limited if we just think about the digital. That's just the contemporary moment, and I think there's much more context, both historically and looking forward.
We have to understand that the digital is already the old technology.
Yeah.
And any quick response that you'd like to share?
I'm usually pretty careful about my terminology, so I'd go back to the record and want to see how I slopped it up, because when I say interdisciplinary, I usually do it with a kind of a sneer, because to me those are the institutional efforts and the rhetoric of interdisciplinarity. I precisely don't use that term. I just use the term multidisciplinary, meaning bringing people who are from different disciplinary perspectives together in a kind of multiple way. So because I'm with you on that one, I've lived with that rhetoric of interdisciplinarity for my entire career as an academic, and I see no more reality and the same kind of rhetoric, and so I don't know that that's going to get us anywhere.
And any early reaction to Howard's intervention around boundary crossing and the difference of audience? That's basically DNA is about boundary crossing, and organizations and institutions that are anything but agile and able to adapt to the audience or to the group formerly known as the audience, which is really now a participatory part of either your world or the world of museums. I know that yours aren't museums alone, but sort of museums.
I actually took your point to be more about that we didn't need to worry about their making practices, because we see a proliferation of making. I thought that was kind of more his point, but I don't know, maybe I missed something.
They were both. I was trying to make both.
Okay. Okay.
And I'm trying to drive a little bit of a conversation on
Yeah.
kind of getting to specific language around gaps. And I thought one
About
of the gaps
gaps.
was around
About
institutional
gaps.
laggard. and all that.
I mean, I think one other thing that Howard was pointing out is the generational differences,
Right.
and that is something. I mean, looking around this room, we don't have representation of that.
Right.
That demographic, and it's actually,
Right.
I think you're exactly right. Well, we have a few, I'm sorry. But we don't have any 5-year-olds in here. And one of the things we found with some of our projects was the attitudes, for example, toward privacy were dramatically different than mine. I'm like realizing that I'm totally like over the hill.
Let's take the next question or comment from up top.
I'll get naked.
Mine is kind of a bridge between the generational gap and what Christiane was saying, is that I agree with Anne and with Jill and Paula about museums, and yet when I start to think about it, digital technology is almost viral in the way it comes into museums. You'd be hard put to find a contemporary large-scale photograph that wasn't made using digital technology. When I start to think about the things that we've shown at our museum, I was thinking, well, we haven't shown digital art, but that's not true at all. In fact, we've had many pieces, we haven't sort of labeled them as digital. And I don't think that the younger generation that we see, the teens and 20-somethings that we work with and desperately try to get into the museum, to them, it's not notable that it's digital. They accept that as just part of their DNA, as you were saying, and what they're interested in is the content rather than the form. They sort of expect that in a way.
Interesting. Holly, I'm going to get back to you, but we've had. So just go ahead. This is again just for the camera.
Sure. I guess maybe connecting Howard's comment to the issue of interdisciplinarity, which is really thinking through the notion of the laboratory or the lab. There's something about. I have 3 kids. Something about the kids' workshop in the museum, which we might think through a little bit more. I mean, having something between the show where you're displaying something and where you're in a workshop where you're being told what to do to produce something. There's something in between, a kind of a laboratory where you listen, where there's a lot of listening, it's more two-way. So both in, keeping the communication going between the generations. There's something there about the laboratory where there's a kind of experiment. We don't know all the answers. You're coming in here, we don't know all the answers. Let's hear what some of the answers might be. So I think that's the kind of conceptual framework, which I think is true with disciplines too. There's the sense that creating fora or, again, the lab where people from different disciplines who are in disciplines are prepared to have more of a permeable membrane around their discipline and will want to listen to other disciplines. So I think there's a connection.
On the Berkeley New Media Center in terms of this issue, I'd be interested in hearing, I suspect Anne would be interested in hearing it as well, because that's the kind of, I'm not sure would you describe it as permeable? Or on the way towards being more permeable, semi-permeable?
Permeable. Well, it's interesting because part of what I've had to do is create this wider net to bring people in. That's why that strategy of thinking about media as ideas or models. So that provides a magnetic, some people from their art history can say, oh, I do, I do that, although they don't do anything digital necessarily, or, they might look at it, a photograph that was made with a digital process, right? But that, is so different than the kind of media art concerns that, content-wise, that I think we're talking about here. That, but to get them in the door, there's a whole bunch of strategies that I've had to employ. Part of it also, I think that the 2 cultures is also a misnomer. Poor language. It's not. It's N cultures now, and they're all have their own cultural differences and languages and biases, and so there's a bunch of wild horses that you try and they will not. You have to lead them to this well, right? So there's all kinds of strategies we're trying to employ, but it's an ongoing challenge. And I will, I don't want to cover up that there's internecine fights that crop up occasionally. I think those are actually good because at least they're talking. But there will be, there's a lot of resentments that go back and forth and misperceptions and things like that. So I end up doing a lot of kind of running interference a lot of that time. But there's a lot of work to do, and I think part of it is this question. I think Christiane Christiana mentions at the beginning about the museums and the sense of access and just where is it going to be shown. And I think that, you know, MOCA is a great example. One of the things that's interesting I found is that it's not accessible from the street. And that's an interesting, maybe this will be addressed with your new building, because you said that the first floor will be open to anyone without admission cost. And I look around at some of the new buildings around this campus. For example, even right here, there's a lot of windows. So the idea being that people can see it without having to, you know, walk through the door, but they can get a sense of what's going on right away. And I think that's actually a really important thing. So that transparency has been very important. So and one of the biggest things I've been working on is getting a space on campus that had a big window. So that, and it's right by the Free Speech Cafe. So you have to walk by it when you get your coffee. And that we're really using that as a way of kind of connecting. Thanks.
Two short comments. One about my 15-year-old son when I was trying to figure out, this is an old story about why at SeaWorld he was watching the big screen behind the whale instead of the whale. And he looked at me and he said, "What's the big deal?" He was 11 at the time. He said, "What's the big deal, Mom? One's dots and one's not." And so, you know, I point out because they really are different than us. And Larry Johnson, the head of the New Media Consortium, just did a Facebook announcement this morning that said what they were talking about at the Smithsonian yesterday is what can cool old people give to kids? And I think sometimes we're so excited, I'm 48. We old people, sometimes we're so excited about the new technologies that we spend a lot of our time trying to learn about these instead of thinking, what have I got that I can give right now that would be a better use of my time to add to this initiative?
Great, good points. Okay, we're going to give the mic to the...
Like to bounce
bounce. Riff, go for it.
Tim, I used to lecture on the fact that the technology was the veil. And coming as an educator, the example of the whale, I would go into the schools and bring the vertebrae of the whale, the lips of the whale, the ooslik of the whale, which is a whale's penis. That's a big part of the Eskimo culture. And I think the media sometimes gets so far removed from the reality that kids don't realize that these things actually exist, that there's a sense of scale. I was at a school yesterday and they were looking at a George O'Keeffe poster. The poster was 3 times the size of the actual work of art. You see the image of a Da Vinci's Mona Lisa and they think it's a gigantic painting and they don't realize it's basically 12 by 10 inches. So I think we have a responsibility to realize that the museum needs to make an effort not to bring the students to the museum to see the technology, but how the museum can open up the doors to go out into the culture. And the culture here, when we look at this environment, where are the poor people? Where is the issue of the diversity? Where are the people that don't have the degrees? Because those are the people that we need to make that connection to. And if we don't adjust that as an ethical issue, a talk about new media of bringing people in is really the wrong direction of a flow for a generation that doesn't have a connection with reality. Thomas Edison said the reason basically he was so bright was he grew up on the farm. Growing up on the farm, you were actually making the mechanics. You saw the nature grow. There was a physicality that is missing from our students. I have a son that's in 1st grade. I want him to go down a hill on a sleigh. He says, "Oh, I can do that on my computer." You know, it's a totally different feel. And if we can't get him in touch with the physicality, I think we're then going to lose the humanity that we so much talk about.
Go right ahead. I'll get to the microphone.
There are 2 additional factors that I haven't really heard much about so far in the discussion. And those of us, I think, many of us who have been involved in institutional, culture, production, building of enterprises, you realize that there's a tremendous level of politicization and capitalization that you go about these processes of aligning your sort of mission and vision around in order to basically promote and enable the movement and trajectory of those enterprises forward. And there's a tremendous level of complexity that's associated with that basis that really has long-term consequences. And and we all know that we need to be very careful about what we wish for here.
Can you tell a short story about what that means in terms of your professional life? And, no, I mean, because I think it's worth having. I mean, this is a living example of someone who, at least currently, is navigating that politicized landscape.
Well, one of the sort of internal debates, and it's an undecided thing from me personally, and it's just. It revolves around the nature of the Cadre Laboratory, which has been in place now for over 20 years. Maybe it's just time to end it. Because the cultural environment really doesn't need another interdisciplinary experimental research laboratory in new media. It may just be that this is a cycle that we've sort of all passed through, and that the issues are really quite different now. The political climate, this moment of transition and paradigm shift, the questions we're asking about the rhetoric that we're using to describe how we go about our practices. Maybe it really is time to make these sorts of changes, and I don't have the answer for it, but I also don't subscribe to the idea that we simply have to preserve. A kind of path forward based on notions about a romanticization of the transdisciplinary, which may or may not prove to be in the long term true.
Bruce, did you want to pick up on that, because Dan wants to?
Just very
quickly. I'm sorry.
It's almost simplistic, but the idea is that within the U.S. we are hopefully seeing a change in how money is distributed. You have the National Science Foundation, the NEA, National Association for the Humanities. If the funding was changed, where art received a larger, humanities received a larger portion, how would that change how institutions are formed? I think some of the art science thing is based that the NSF is one of a much larger funder than NEA.
Important question, Carl, and then we'll come back.
So I have a question for you both about teaching and pedagogy in general, and it actually bounces off of this thing about non-physicality or materiality, or not, which I completely disagree with, and I would say that in fact part of the problem is the way that the humanities have treated technology, because if we're going to deal with hermeneutics seriously, you're talking about doing a close reading. And so my question is how do you, just as engineers blow off humanities, humanists often blow off the realities of engineering. So to really understand Ken's work best, you should have an understanding of robotics. I'll make that claim, right? So how do you teach humanists to be able to truly do a close reading of engineering such that they take the code or the algorithm or the medium seriously? Because I would argue actually that youth, when they're producing media and they're able to talk about mixing together platforms and APIs, are connecting with a level of physicality and reality that is actually there, and that in many ways we have to catch up with, and humanities people have ignored.
Very interesting. Ken, you're nodding as a kind of physicality, a kind of visceral response to something that Carl.
I mean, I can respond. I mean, my job's not to train humanists in the sense of my colleagues. I feel like all I can do is call them to take on the commitment to teach themselves, right? For kind of peer groups, but exactly. I mean, that's kind of what the basis of software studies is. That's kind of going out at now at UCSD and so on. Is we have to engage in the materiality of the underlying applications, the code, the language, the logics, the rhetorics, and the and the structure of that. In my case, I have been a very selective learner. I've learned what I need to know to read deeply the pieces that I find critically, of critical interest. Like the visual thesaurus, for example. I do a close reading of the visual thesaurus on a number of terms. That meant getting the developer's kit to get a sense of what was under the hood. Not because I was ever going to develop in it, but because I needed to get a sense of what the possibilities were so I could read better about what was manifesting when I enter in my terms and so on. I'm not going to do that for everything because I don't actually, to tell you the truth, find all things equally fascinating. That happens to be something I found fascinating.
But I would just follow.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with the software studies
Yeah.
model, and I would say that's what's interesting about that is that's very different than saying the phrase digital humanities. And in some ways, we may need to think more about what software studies is doing, which is still a small part
Yeah.
of the humanities in general,
Right.
rather than the notion of digital humanities. But
Right. I mean, the digital humanities in this country right now, given that it's like 4 years old as a movement, is or 5 years maybe, is, you know, has a very, as a formal kind of sense of something that people were recognizing. I mean, it has a very broad agenda that goes way back to, well before we had the term digital humanities. I mean, I would go, you know, certainly all of our digital archiving, our kind of metadata standards, discussions about books and I mean, that was all kind of debates and conversations and projects that humanists were deeply involved in. I think, you know, the long history of hypertext and electronic literature, which was never considered the digital humanities, but that, you know, all those working in that, and that's a 20-year-old movement at this point, you know, that is lost to us because the creative pieces are gone, we can't read them anymore. You know, so the digital humanities as a formation is relatively new. It's about 5 years.
Was there a particular emergence of it, of that term?
Of the humanities.
Yeah.
I think we could.
There was a digital humanities center at UVA for at least 15 years.
Well, I guess that's right. Myth over, yeah.
I don't know if it's running that for, I mean, I even know longer than 15 years ago. And I think digital humanities has a much longer history. And if I could sort of jump in, I think, I mean, I'm sitting here, you know, agreeing and disagreeing on the details, but, you know, I guess my big gap question is, how do we move forward? I mean, I think literally I've had this same conversation with half the people in the room, I mean, literally 10 years ago. And why? You know, I mean, it's really a big question that I think we're all, you know, Christiana's bringing up around museums, and Sarah's trying to do it at the New York Art School, and you're dealing with it in really fantastic ways. But somehow there's this sense of we keep coming up with the same questions. They're not radically different than what we were talking about in a very explicit way 10 years ago. Why is that?
Start talking. This is just a good.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just going to throw out there that, I mean, in terms of what we call this sort of movement of transdisciplinarity or whatever, you know, I don't know. For me, I have a degree in integrated art and a degree in electronic integrated art and electronic music, and I teach emerging arts, and, you know, it all kind of means the same thing. And as an artist first, who's come to academia sort of as an artist, you know, what I find all the time is that despite what we call it and, you know, how it functions institutionally, the students and the artists are doing this stuff already. So it really, I think, is a matter of embracing the change from the ground up and really looking to how it's happening. I mean, I teach a class in like collaborative art practices, and all my students are like, finally, there's a framework for this because we've been doing this forever. And so I feel like a lot of this change is sort of looking at how these things are already happening and sort of tracing what's going on. And on a similar note, kind of like what Carl was saying reminded me of is that I think that with this generation in terms of institutional change or whatever, like it's really important to embrace skill sharing too. And a lot of the collaborative processes aren't taught necessarily from the top down, but are also taught amongst peers and amongst colleagues. And so I think it's really important to create a space not only for ground up learning, but also for peer, skills sharing, et cetera.
Right. And physical space that Anne, you referred to can certainly be an enabler, or as it turns out more times than not, just the opposite. It ends up being something that is difficult to overcome. Just before we kind of go back, because I can see hands who've already participated, I want to offer George and anyone else who hasn't had a chance to kind of contribute. Again, trying to think here to that hot pink sheet that you have around gaps, issues, whether it's the issue that we've been having the conversation for a decade, why don't we have other questions, or why haven't the questions that we've been asking for 10 years made much movement, or whether there are other kinds of key questions that are coming up. There's certainly been lots of interesting conversations about the things that I'm hearing people in the room who are very comfortable with, sort of whether they live more comfortably in the museum world or they live more comfortably in the academic world. And for some of you who are border shifting regularly, but more likely sort of internal critiques of the kind of the domains that we're most comfortable with. I am looking to kind of find a way to also put some other questions that you have on the table in terms of the gaps from either the digital humanities perspective as an emergent set of multidisciplinary, let's use that language for right now, and for those of you who come from the museum world, sort of experiencing your own travails as you've been trying to think about how to engage in the transformational activities to be responsive to your missions as, in our case, a non-collecting art museum, but for those of you who have other experiences as well. So, George and anyone else who hasn't had a chance to chime in, I want to give you the privilege first. If you'll just pass it back to Indra when you're done.
I want to build on something you said, which is the word up there, siloism. I think there's an incredible siloism within the arts, and that one of the problems is we haven't recognized the power of digital technologies to be very similar across all different art forms. I've got to say that the most incredible work today has been Maury, because while it started as something going from the sciences to the arts, between the earthquake data and Ken, then it kept moving and morphing as a sound artist took over and as a dancer took over. And now you see music, dance, literature, sculpture, all of these technologies, all of these media, which are using the same technologies and the same tools to be essentially the same thing in different forms. And a personal story is, I remember at the museum where I used to work, the biggest fight I ever got was when I tried to show Judd Morrissey's The Jew's Daughter as a piece of new media work, and the powers that be in the museum said, no, it's literature. Why is it in a visual art museum?
Hi. Well, we've heard several times this morning about the idea that technology can be a frame of mind, not a machine. And I'm wondering specifically here, and this is, I want to be succinct in the point, if one of these gaps is that in contemporary art, have we, whether it's in the museum world or in the academic art historical world, have we thought about interpretation also being a frame of mind? Interpreting art, I think museums might be more on cue with catering to their audiences and encouraging interpretation to be a frame of mind. But I think that while us who working in the field, that might be more obvious to us, but sort of teaching a general audience about interpretation as a frame of mind, a way of thinking, and sort of broadening the definition of art from that perspective.
And I think that certainly resonates from Ken's notion of the prism and the lens being kind of one of the fundamental pieces of continuity, at least in this dialogue. Please, and then we're going to start. If I don't see new hands, I'm going to start. We're going back to folks who've already got a chance.
Yeah, I think I wanted to touch a little bit on the fact that I think some ways we get stuck because our attitudes towards risk change. So we always seem to be in a counterbalance between when we can be more explorative and more experimental and we have an accepting attitude towards risk, and then you almost find yourself in kind of this endless crevasse where you're having to sort of dig yourself out. And you're not just digging yourself out, you're digging the culture out as well, whether that's at a policy level or a funding level. And then in terms of just picking up on some of the things that we were talking about in terms of interpretation, I think in a way, it is moving beyond that kind of interdisciplinary, because I don't really like that language either. But maybe there are multimodal ways that we can talk about sort of interpreting works and really sort of looking at layered experiences rather than a kind of mono experience within a kind of museum culture. So.
Terrific. All right. Please, Jill wants to jump in, so she gets privilege, and then we'll start with Sarah and start the second round of conversation.
Well, I'm struck by the recurrence of the word design, and I really loved your conversation about how you had to go out and create a new space that could support the multidisciplinary work you were doing, because it didn't exist within the institutional framework of a university. So one gap that I'm wondering we might address is, and I just whispered to Anne, what's missing among us is an architect. And it strikes me that the whole issue around design from a physical planning point is something my consciousness has been raised since I've been working with an architect over the past 2 years, how much space matters. And the second is the issue that I think a gap we're not talking about is governance, and the difference between the kinds of organizational structures we're working within. Some of us have independent think tanks. Some of us are working within labyrinthine universities. Some of us might have an independent think tank within a university. And I wonder what the significance and meaning of those different governance structures. Paula and I are museums, but she's in a really big one that's general. One of the reasons why we can do more new media work is we're more nimble, flexible, because we're independent and we're specifically, expressly focused on contemporary art. And the reason I bring that up is selfishly because if our institutions are going to be working together between a large university and a smaller independent contemporary art museum, what are the best practices that we might be looking toward to help us be nimble and achieve some of these goals?
So sleeping with the elephant comes with lots of trepidation. So again, one last go around, because that's great. If you feel like you want to jump in, please do. Just a kind of a process check, about 20 minutes of additional conversation around reflections and gaps. I'd like to offer both Ken and Anne, at the end, I'd like to come back and afford you a chance to kind of do some kind of, if you will, kind of last thoughts about the morning session.
I hope this is both addressing gaps that we can think about and also, Steve, shifts in practice. I'm finding a real change in attitude from the sciences, where in fact there's a looking towards the humanities. The recent HCI conference in Florence last year was started by two very well-known scientists asking the humanities to solve the problem of insight, and saying there's a crisis in method, and we need to look at sketching, we need to look at methods from the sciences. And in the field of data visualization, I sit on a supercomputing network steering board, and we've started a program in digital humanities that, and our way of looking at it in that context, is intensive data visualization work that can bring knowledge to the sciences from a humanities perspective about the nature of data. So shift in the sciences, dramatic fundamental shift. Secondly, cultural difference. Technologies are not experienced in the same way by all cultures. And issues of scalability, issues of globalization, issues of cultural difference are fundamentally issues of the humanities. And the approaches that we need to take within whatever institutions need to look at the question of difference, locality, transformation. Third shift, the role of the museum as a space that's a neutral space. I mean, the kinds of conversations we're talking about in experiential learning or living laboratories or places where people can get their hands dirty, there's a role that museums and galleries can play that are very process-based as sites of learning and experience. And then fourth, the fourth point is really, you know, on sort of research methodology and ways of thinking through driving, again, I started with this, but questions of aesthetics. which I see as questions of lived experience, materiality, how we understand how technologies manifest in our lives. Those are points of crisis within both design and also within technology making. And my fifth point is the crisis. If we were in a Canadian conversation right now, it would be focused on the role of those of us in the academy, those of us in the cultural sector, at solving the crisis. And we are at the same table as the manufacturing industries, high technology companies, government right now, having a conversation about what knowledge we bring to the crisis. And it's just very curious to fly into the US, and I think it's because you just elected this new president who you truly believe will help you solve things, and you're all in this, fabulous state of euphoria. But we don't have such a leader right now in my country, and unfortunately, we've had to revert to this very intensive process where all of the really kind of almost sometimes esoteric collaboration we've done in the past 20 years, we're now really nose to the grindstone in trying to come up with solutions that are pragmatic but also fundamentally ethical in solving the crisis. So I just want to...
Right. And that goes back in some ways, that last point to Joel.
Yeah, and I wanted to say that to Joel, which is, that's where your knowledge comes to bear,
Absolutely.
really.
Yeah, I just wanted to address Steve's question. There's a lag time issue with the 10 years. Because I think a lot of us have been doing this for even more than 10 years. But I wonder, either one of you brought up the whole issue of the internet operating systems, that there's a huge gap in archiving art history, net art in particular. The operating systems change so quickly. How is that being brought into the continuity of what we're doing now? So I think the ideas were there, but I think, on an international level, the technology has not really leveled out yet, and we've lost a lot. And so we're continuing to rebuild.
Okay, so we're just going to sort of let the microphone sort of organically flow up the hill and then down again.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to politely and warmly disagree with Steve. I think we've had almost tectonic shifts in the last 10 years. I think the fact that 10 years ago the NEH did not recognize digital as a forum, we now have a whole division focused on digitization, and one of the new initiatives desperately trying now to find humanists who want to mine data. They have access to supercomputers, they have relationships with science departments, and they're really pulling people in. I think we now do have acceptance, infrastructure, funding, relationships. I think the opportunities now are tremendous. Like now, there's no excuse, it seems.
Right, which gets back to Jill's question about sort of best practices, and I think that the institutionalization of some of these things points to that need to think reflectively about that as well.
Yeah. Let's also add that Anne shared with us the MacArthur Initiative, which is the first but not the last of such national philanthropy in this country, trying to also push this piece forward, which wasn't on the broad agenda not so many years ago. Saul?
Yeah, actually coming out of Joel's reflection on having created institutions and do you preserve them forever, one of the things that I think is a real challenge here and a real gap here is that we have yet to talk about explicit ideologies, explicit histories, explicit ideals, explicit methodologies, nor have we been self-reflective.
This is one of those self-reflective. All right, I'm going to come down again. I'm going to give the top row, and then we're going to come down.
Enough.
We'll get Joel, and we'll give Jared a shot at jumping in as well. Please.
I actually also wanted to pick up on Steve's question and do a lot of footnotes. As I'm sure many of you know, there is a Digital Humanities Manifesto done by the Mellon Seminar in Digital Humanities at UCLA, which is up and on the NetTime list, which I'm sure many of you are on. There's currently a lively discussion about that, just to mention it. I also participated in a conference on governance at the University of Milwaukee a couple of years ago. There's an issue of First Monday that deals with that. And that brings me to the last comment on self-reflexivity. I think that every question we brought up in this room so far has been thought about in detail by someone. And I'm sure if we would all do research more, then, you know, yeah. Then we also would find a lot of writing on it. Obviously, within this context, you can only cover so much. And to Steve's question, I share the frustration of having had many of these conversations for 10 years. And yes, it's very boring. But at the same time, we have moved, as so many of the comments here have shown, to a completely different level. And it just happens slowly. And just to summarize some fundamentals, I think we're still grappling with issues about bringing digital technologies and digital art into the museum context, and we do that. And that won't change probably within the next 50 years. But can I just quickly finish? Coming back to Howard, I think pointed out a huge paradigm shift. We're dealing with a generation that has moved way beyond that. And among many of the artists I'm talking to, the agreement is we don't need the museum. I know we have, it's fine to be there and occasionally, but we have so much more agency in the world with millions of people engaging. And that is really the landscape we are looking at today and we are already engaging with. And it is a major paradigm shift. And I think we moved ahead in that respect. There's a different world going on out there. And just the issues have completely changed for me within the past 10 years, and at the same time, I'm grappling with some of the same challenges.
Can I ask you, in terms of your museum, 100 years of art and technology has been ignored, right? Why now?
Why now what?
Why now the digital, not the 100 years of technology, art and technology? Why not rewrite the history rather than subscribe to the new?
Well, has been my mantra actually, and I've been working on that about doing exhibitions on it.
1968, art.
There are programs
1968, Museum of Modern Art, machine art.
Yes,
nothing really significant until recently.
Good lunchtime conversation. I can tell that's going to be a great lunchtime. We're going to give a couple of other folks who want to jump in. Darren's been wanting to get in. Folks are going to give again just the last couple of words to the folks who've taken some time to organize their thoughts up front. Thanks for all the interventions. There should be lots of lunchtime conversation and beyond. Darren?
Now I got pressure. You know, it's kind of funny. I think of it like if I'm an ice sculptor, time passes, my content melts. If I write a book, time passes, my context melts. And I've been doing new media for a long time, and I always knew this was going to happen. My fear as we keep moving forward and making everything new media is that we're going to have nothing left. So archiving to me is very important, and sort of the documenting around what we do may be the only thing we have left. So there's that general fear that I think makes things a little different than some of the stuff we're talking about, but I don't have any of the answers.
Okay, so not to sort of leave on that kind of downer there, Jared, but we want to give Joel a chance to chime in. He's been wanting to come back, and then last couple of words to you folks.
So the optimistic side is
we only have politics, finance.
Is that this crisis, the many crises. Globally, locally, regionally, nationally, whether it's globalization or the collapse in the economy or human rights, these things are proportionally have escalated in their seriousness in the past 5 years to a point where we find ourselves today having to reassess some of the decisions that we're going to be making about plotting trajectories to the future that are going to really lay a kind of groundwork for what happens next. You know, and so when we're looking at, you know, the predictions of coming out of the current economic crisis in 18 to 24 months, which I think is, you know, over, you know, that expectation is questionable. When we come out the other side of it, what do we start to look like? And I think this crisis of opportunity is one that artists have a particular obligation to respond to in ways that literally capitalize on the tools that are present today that allow them to execute on experimentations and research and investigations that are going to deliver up possibilities but also critique.
Great, bravo. Okay, no need to summarize, but rather to simply do some reflection yourself on what you've heard here today in the context of your own thoughts and work.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, do you want me to start?
Sure.
Just a couple points that I would respond to. One is I agree with the point about embrace the change from the ground up, that's kind of the notion that the digital youth are already doing this. So in part, it's kind of beholden on us to rethink our pedagogies, to address, I think the practices, whether it's social networking or opening up our classrooms that are not the hermetically sealed things. But after we do that and we go, okay, they're doing this. They're already doing this. They're mashing up and they're remixing and they're doing pastiche and so on. Then what do they need to learn? And that is a privilege of being an elder. And I will honor the sensibilities and the practices of digital youth in the sense of knowing how to inspire, engage, and make use of their energies. But I still think a question is, and then what do they need to learn? Here's things that I think they're not learning. I think they have a very atomistic view of culture. So when you say that they're out there and they're saying, well, I'm making this now, they're making it, but they're not making it in the same kind of conversation that I would like to see them engage in. They're making it. And I think in part my sense about the museum is a narrative machine. It's a machine, I saw these pieces when they were all over San Jose, and I didn't see them in the way I saw them here last night because they were in a very different kind of narrative context. Not a heavy-handed narrative context, it's just I didn't apprehend them in the way that I apprehended them when they were in the brick and mortar space of MOCA. And that gave me a different insight into them than I had had when I saw them up in San Jose. So that there is something really important that doesn't happen when you're surfing the web and getting your experiences one site at a time, which is you don't get the narrative or a narrative. And maybe there are, we're right to contest any master narratives and so on, but a narrative would be good because I'm not sure they're very good at putting together kind of narratives that go back and kind of say, well, this has been, like you were saying, Billy Kluver's work, this is, echoes of EAT, it's echoes of the Machine Project and the Machine Art Project. I see that and I see this conversation unfolding. Now that's a historical consciousness that comes with being, older, but I think we should start thinking about how do we, if one more student says to me, why is it important to remember? Which I have had students say, I think that's a real problem. This kind of presentism of.
Okay. Well, first I want to thank Megan here for doing this thing, which is like a particular art form in its own right. It's kind of being able to summarize this very well. And Lev, you did a great job keeping this whole thing flowing. That's another skill that I admire. I think, Steve, you're right on one hand. We have been talking about this for a while. But I also think that things have changed. I think that to some degree, looking at the evolution of how video art got accepted into the mainstream contemporary art world, it took a lot longer. So we have to be realistic about the process. I think that we should not burn down all of our efforts yet, because I think there's actually there is progress. I agree. It's been in fits and starts. There's been steps backward. I think that there's a lot more engagement that needs to happen with contemporary art. That we tend to be a little bit. There's a tendency to ghettoize in our own thinking that we don't connect with what's really happening in the contemporary art world.
and bring in those kind of name artists or engage with them, and sort of seeing ourselves as somehow different, that media art is different or net art is different than that. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. One other thing that I think is different, and it alludes to what Sarah's saying about the crisis, I think that it's probably the best thing that's happened to us, this financial. I think it absolutely got I think it got Obama elected. I think that it's clearing out a lot of dead wood and changing a lot of attitudes. I think there was a huge amount of impacted, I don't know, a lot of good minds going to Wall Street that hopefully that's going to turn around a little bit. So I think there's something good that will come out of it. There is a sense of hopefulness. I mean, Obama has a very big interest in digital technology. He's got his BlackBerry, and he's into science and technology in a whole new way that I think could end up changing a lot of things that could actually be very constructive. All this interest from the humanities and the museums now, that you have MacArthur, the Carnegie Foundation, big institutions that are actually starting to lead the way, because I think a lot of others will follow them, the National Endowment for the Humanities. So those are all developments that are positive, that we can actually say are changing. Just these kind of conversations, I think it's important to keep having them. Every time I learn I get some new things, some new phrases and terminologies that I hadn't, or insights that I hadn't had before. So I think even though there's a little bit of, I think you're right that we have to be aware of the past for the reasons that Anne was just saying, but at the same time thinking optimistically that there are things that are changing in a good way. So I think that hopefully it'll be interesting. We'll probably be having this conversation in 10 years from now, but it'll be a little bit more nuanced from then. So.